Hello, everyone. Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and hello from Harry and the rest of the gang, being Jen Rubin, Andrew Weissmann, and Norm Eisen. And we thought the report, the behemoth report that dropped a couple days ago, occasions a much broader discussion than the sound bites we've all been doing our best to say on TV, but there's just a lot of big, gnarly issues here that we wanted to treat in some depth. So, thank you everyone for being here. Let me just serve up first. Okay, you are Jack Smith, who's already a little bit busy on Mar-a-Lago. You clone yourself, split in two, and you receive this 850-page tome. Are you happy, and what now?
The first thing I would do if I were Jack Smith is just strike out all the legal analysis and look just the facts, ma'am, like Dragnet. Just the facts.
Of which there are plenty.
I think that's wrong, by the way. If I were Jack Smith, I would study the law too, but I think Andrew knows him well. I think he's gonna say, okay, what facts are there here that I don't have yet? What evidence?
Well, and Andrew, you suggested that it's pretty. I saw you on TV say it's pretty voluminous. You think there's a lot of new stuff that doesn't duplicate what DOJ has done, yeah?
Well, we don't know exactly what DOJ has done, but my strong suspicion is that, and we've heard it from the committee chair as well, is that there's just a lot more that Congress has done than DOJ, and it's just worth reminding people that is extremely unusual, and I think it accounts for why there has been such antipathy by certain members of the committee towards DOJ, and there's been sort of this play out in public of this tension. But I think that's largely behind us. So all this information is now public because the Republicans were going to have it anyway. So it's now been made public to everyone, and it's sort of essentially, to me, it's like not great for DOJ that's happened, but it was going to go to the Republicans anyway, meaning it was going to go to Trump. So it's something they had to do, and everyone has to live with it. I think there are a lot of leads to follow up on. There are a lot of witnesses with that. Were asked questions that I think if you were DOJ, you would have a lot more questions. They're much more experienced in terms of doing witness interviews. And also they're asking for a very different purpose, and they're thinking about proof beyond a reasonable doubt and the rules of evidence. So there is a ton to go through. And it needs to be gone through by people who are very experienced in doing these kinds of investigations and thinking about admissible evidence. And then I think the other thing is I would look at it very much with an eye toward who can I flip? Is there evidence of which gives you toeholds on people who have committed either false statements or perjury or obstruction as a way to move people to cooperate? And then just one quick anecdote, since you always are retrying your last case, but bringing those kinds of charges has an enormous benefit in terms of having defense lawyers speak to their clients about needing to be truthful. When I was on the special counsel, one of the prosecutions we brought, which was relatively minor, and people were always speculating about why did we do it and what does this person know, and it involved like a 10th year associate at Skadden Arps in London. And I still remember Bob Mueller, who lied through his teeth. It was just sort of crazy how much he was lying to protect Manafort and two of his allies. And I still remember Bob Mueller coming in after we charged and convicted him, saying, this is just so great for a shot across the bow for the people coming in. And not that long after, Don McGahn came in and was quite good at volunteering information. You'll never know whether it's a cause and effect, but it just isn't a bad thing for those people who have reputable counsel to see that you're willing to charge people for making particularly egregious false statements. So I just think that if you're Jack Smith, that's one of the things, we've seen a complete dearth of prosecutions. I mean, it's just, everyone's talking about stuff, but we've seen nothing.
Let me follow up. Let me frame this up.
Let me phrase it
go ahead.
Carefully, which is obviously we've seen people who are the foot soldiers. Obviously, they've done an amazing job. But in terms of what I would call the sort of important January 6th investigation in terms of higher ups, we've seen nothing, including these kinds of false statements, obstruction charges. And that's kind of surprising to me, but it's also, I think, a sign of where the investigation is, meaning I'm very happy Jack's there.
Hey everyone, we're taking a quick break to ask you to take a second to like and subscribe. It's a quick thing that really helps the show. Thanks, and back to the video.
To drill down on something that Andrew said, and to bring it back also to the lack of prosecution, I think Jack Smith is going to look very carefully at both the role of Chesebro and Mark Meadows. And the number of links, the number of connections that they have within the plot to develop the phony electors was really quite stunning to me. And I'm not sure that DOJ has all of those yet. Those are the people who would be phenomenally flippable if the DOJ can present to them very credible charges, which I think they can on some of the bigger issues. And it also perhaps sheds light on why the DOJ did not go after Mark Meadows for contempt. I think he remains the biggest fish that they can possibly get to flip on Trump. I think there's an interesting ethical legal issue as to whether he is of such, responsibility and both legally, morally for what went on that you really don't want to flip him. But obviously the biggest fish to fry here is Donald Trump. And I think Meadows, what you get from the public hearings was Meadows kind of being passive and out of it and unable to move Trump. What you get from reading the transcripts and the report is how active he was in collecting these things, in bringing people forward to being at the heart of this conspiracy. And I think if I'm Jack Smith, he probably doesn't have all of those. He may have some of those. And I kind of would start there and see if you can really build a case with Meadows, with Chesebro, sit them down with their lawyers and say, here's the indictment. What do you want to do?
You'd actually give them the draft indictment that would be the classic. I want to get back to Meadows. But can I just ask a couple general questions? And so Norm, this would be a time in a normal investigation, you would think, where there'd be a sort of race to the prosecutors. Who's going to be first? There's obviously, as best we can tell, haven't been prominent cooperators. There's a list of, potentially 10 or, in that neighborhood. Do you anticipate now people, wanting to be proactive, or because of the whole dynamic with Trump and the Republican Party, et cetera, is this just all rules are off?
I don't think it's just the dynamic with Trump, although that's certainly at play. And you see that in another thing that we'll talk about, which is the kind of the Cassidy Hutchinson, Stephan Passantino relationship, which I think puts Stephan in hot water with the bar. He's already been put on leave of absence by one of his law firms, potential criminal issues. This is not like the cases that we cut our teeth on, where you have the clear illegality, and people just feeling the pressure to cut an early deal, like the Enron case where I was opposite Andrew, He stole one of my best associates, Kathy Rumler. Or the Archer Daniels Midland case, where I actually did cut a deal for the main cooperator, or the FTX case, where we now learn that that two
people, yeah,
SBF's closest associates, Miss Ellison and Mr. Wang, stampeded to cut, they cut deals, but they're going to get serious jail time as part of their deals because it's such a massive fraud. The problem here, the distinguishing characteristic for me, and Andrew, what you did to poor Mr. van der Zwaan, that Skadden associate, or my friend Greg Craig, that was really outrageous. Although I guess, we'll talk about Greg. That's why I'm a career defense lawyer with only very occasional sojourns. It took Trump to lure me into the government. I
wouldn't want to diagram this sentence you're in the middle of.
It's amazing, isn't it? The power of a run-on. But to come back to come at last to the period in my sentence, this is not that kind of a slam dunk case. Like an Enron or an FTX or an ADM. This is a really tough case, tough criminal case. And it's of the main threats to Trump, it's probably fourth. I even put it after of course, the Mar-a-Lago case, the Georgia prosecution, which we'll talk about, AG Tish James civil case, that's number 3. That's a quasi death penalty, corporate death penalty, even though it's a civil case. This is number 4. And so if I'm a defendant, I don't buy the holding Meadows back to cooperate, or my friend Dennis Aftergood, he was cited in the report, maybe Meadows has already cut a deal. No. I think that they didn't do Meadows because they want to preserve, the DOJ, OLC wants to preserve the privilege of White House officials when they reasonably cooperate. Meadows somewhat did. They want to maintain the executive prerogatives. And so I don't think you're going to see any stampede. That is an insane run-on sentence with multiple, like waving the matador, waving the cape, Toro, at the prosecutors.
All right, and we're everyone's screaming in the stands. One other sort of general setup question, Andrew. You said you made some comment about how aspects of this that might be unwelcome, and Chuck Rosenberg I know has been big on. Oh man, please don't do us any favors. To me. I mean, my watchword as a prosecutor is there's no fact I should be afraid of. The more information, the better. And to me, this is a really, really good development to have this data dump. On the other hand, I'd say it's an unalloyed good to the public. And I can see a couple downsides here. For one, it's going to, picking on what Norm just said, it's going to totally inflame expectations that they're going to be bringing charges soon, and no way they're brought soon. And there's you'll have, I think, a lot of now dual statements from different witnesses. Maybe that produces Brady stuff that you have to turn over. But if as a prosecutor, I love getting 2 different statements, either with friendly witnesses that I can really, zero in and shape what I want them to get at the truth of and the best presentation of what they want to say, or with hostile ones that you can maybe show are they're being less than candid. So I see this as, a 90% good thing. Others disagree and think that Jack Smith, we're using him as a synecdoche, can I use that word, for DOJ here generally, but that Jack Smith, some people think crap, wish that hadn't happened. Well, any views on whether it was a, basically very good day for the department when this report dropped. And as you've said, Andrew, I mean, unusual is an understatement that Congress is, serving as the whole kind of junior varsity or whatever, the clerk preparing the bench memo from hell of all time.
Well, I think it's really important for people to look at this in terms of two separate audiences. So I think in terms of public education, this is an unmitigated good. And I don't think that should be taken lightly, because if there's going to be any prosecution anywhere of the former president, whether it's at the state or federal level, having public buy-in is going to be absolutely critical and essential in a way that, having been in the special counsel investigation, I think we sort of underestimated. I mean, we obviously didn't have to deal with the prospect of charging the president immediately because we couldn't. But this idea that you needed to educate the public, I think the January 6th committee has been completely on top of and has really performed just yeoman's work and given cover for DOJ and actually pushed DOJ because of that. So I think the fact that all of this has been made public is fantastic in terms of that role. If you look at it from DOJ's perspective, the ideal is that they would have obtained privately all of this information so that they could pursue the leads and develop any sort of cases, et cetera, without it being turned over to the defense yet. Obviously, there's a point in time if someone's charged where they have those obligations. That would have been the ideal. The ideal was not going to happen when the House flipped, because all of the information would be available to the Republicans, which means it would be, let's just get real, it would be available to Donald Trump and his allies. So given that reality, yes, it would have been good for the committee to have previously given this to DOJ. They apparently gave some, but the vast majority they did not, for a whole variety of reasons that one can debate. But given that reality, then the next best thing is to just to get the benefit of public education, get the benefit of not allowing the Republicans to cherry pick what gets talked about, and to make it available to everyone. And it's not the worst thing in the world. I mean, it's not like DOJ isn't going to have other evidence that is not disclosed, but it isn't the ideal form that you want to have information. It does make it easier for potential defendants to what we used to refer to as puddle jump, which is to dance around the bad evidence.
Let me push on 1 second, and I know you're coming in here, but Andrew, I think that's assuming they would have gotten everything. I actually think some of the interviews and the dynamic, it wouldn't have been the same as a 302 with an FBI person there, et cetera. I think they get more information than otherwise, and your assumption is they would have had it all. It would have been.
Who's the they? Who's the they?
In other words, the committee has turned over to the department much more than simply if the department had, by the way, a year that it would produce on its own. In other words, the interviews that people give to the Congress in some respects are different. So in other words, your assumption is DOJ would have gotten it all and it would have been secret until there's a trial. I wonder if that's right. Actually, I'll just put that out there because I interrupted you, Jen. Where were you going?
I took Andrew to say that that DOJ would have gotten the information anyway from Congress when the committee changed, because the Republicans would then have it and deposit over. Not that they could have redone them or that they would have.
Oh, I see. But come on, the report has to be public for the reasons you say.
So yeah. To Norm's point about raising expectations and no rush to the courtroom, I think we have to think a little bit less like lawyers and think like the public. They want to know that something is happening. And that something, that news void and appetite is going to get filled. It's just not going to get filled with the January 6th. It's going to get filled with Fani Willis, which is going to use a lot of this information. It's going to be filled, I think, by a Mar-a-Lago prosecution, which if we are anywhere in the realm of, understanding what's going on, is a much easier, much more confined, much more prosecutable case, perhaps as early as, first quarter or so of next year. So I think, although, yes, the public wants to see federal prosecution trump of insurrection, there's plenty that's going to keep them busy, as it were. And I don't think the public necessarily has a preference or a mindset. This is only a state prosecution versus a federal prosecution. Yeah. They're going to see these same facts, ones that, as Norma's pointed out, that I laid out, picking out the facts from the report that relate to Georgia, applied to Georgia statute. There's some really helpful information in there. And I think
yeah, that's your lead line, Norm, because you're all over Georgia.
Yeah,
as it were.
I remember I was on must have been 18 months ago. I was on a CNN show, and I had just released the first edition of our big Brookings Georgia report, where we predicted Trump faced substantial risk of exposure. It's many of the same people: Trump, Eastman, Clark, Giuliani. Chesbrough, we talk about Chesbrough, Meadows. And the anchors, after the thing ended, they're like, come on, that guy's never going to get prosecuted. And in Georgia, give me a break. I'm like, I left my crystal ball at home. All I know is the evidence, the facts that we have, and the law. And we have two smoking guns that the committee really focused on. If you read, Jen did a great column when the executive summary came out, applying through the lens of our now second edition of our Big Brookings report. And Andrew and I wrote together one of these in the form of a long prosecution memo with other distinguished co-authors for the Mar-a-Lago documents, which are the two places where there's the most risk. But if you read now we have the full report, Jen, after your column. If you read that through the lens, not of the federal charges, but of the Georgia charges that we lay out, as Jen pointed out in her first column on the executive summary, there's a devastating case to be made. Georgia law is an excellent fit. Fani Willis started sprinting basically on January 3rd after that tape came out. It's a smoking gun tape of Trump saying, I just want to find 11,780 votes, one more than we have. I mean, what better admission could you ask for than that? And together with the other smoking
audio
gun,
tape, thank you so much.
And the other smoking gun is the fake electoral slates and these Chesbrough memos and Eastman memos saying, this is dicey, this is illegal. So Fani Willis has two sets of smoking guns, and I think she has a nice, clean, you could try that case in a week as a defense lawyer for the most part for more than 3 decades. That is the case that I would fear. You play the tape, you show the phony electoral slates, you do David Schaefer, who's the organizer of the slates, the former head of the Georgia Republican Party. I'm sure she's flipped some of the people who signed the fake slates. They're in the report saying, hey, we were tricked. We were useful idiots. Robert Sinners, of all names, his name is Robert Sinners.
So, Norm, can I ask you a question about this?
So that's a scary case. That's a scary case. And so is
Well, we've got
Mar-a-Lago, where you have
follow-up on that,
100
yeah.
smoking guns. Andrew.
So, question is, in reading the report, I agree with you. There's enormous additional proof. I was struck by how much Mark Meadows and Rudy Giuliani are so involved, and
Amazing.
not to mention also a sitting senator. And to what extent do you think that there will be state and federal coordination to see if they can flip either of them? I mean, or they'll just get charged.
Can I add to Andrew's question?
Those additional defendants, because it seems hard to me that you would charge Trump and not Mark Meadows, given just what's in the proof.
And we know Giuliani's a target, but I just want to add one question. This is to everyone. It sure seems like you were prescient 18 months ago, but I see it maybe first out of the gate, but who knows when it gets to the finish line? Because, don't you think that there's a year, 18 months, even more of pretrial litigation with gnarly federal state issues before a jury is impaneled? So, and I don't want to preempt Andrew's question. What are your thoughts on all those things?
So
Everybody.
I don't, and then I'll defer to Jen, because Jen was one of the first. Jen, I think you wrote about that first Brookings report, and you're like, here's the silver bullet. And I think it is, and I think it's very likely, no guarantees, very likely Trump and others get charged. Andrew or Harry, whether Meadows is in that group, I think depends a lot. He's appeared by now. We have to assume there's nothing public. He's appeared by now before the Georgia grand jury. He lost his bid to stop that. Depends on, did he take the fifth? Did he testify and try to exonerate himself? Andrew, I don't think there has been no sign whatsoever of state-federal coordination on the Georgia case. There's been, now maybe it's happening, maybe there's conversations with the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Criminal Division Main Justice, but if I were Merrick Garland, I would want to reach to that, right? Or for that matter, Jack Smith, I would want to, the thing could end up it will end up in federal court on an attempted removal. I would try to find a way to designate, this happens, as you all know, you get a federal prosecutor or multiple federal prosecutors designated onto a state case. I would designate, there's been no sign of that whatsoever. And I think Merrick has been, several of us know him well, he's been, as far as I can tell, he's handled these democracy crimes. This really, I think of him as election denial crimes. This is the birth of the election denial movement, and it verged into criminality. A lot of that happened, by the way, in its 2022 iteration as well, where you had Trump acolytes who were state officials refusing to certify in violation of criminal dereliction of duty statutes all over the country. But coming back here, I don't see any sign of the coordination. It's a pity. I wish they would coordinate. Fani Willis is not going to go hand in hand, though. She's very independent. She's proud with good reason. I mean, look at her winning record. So, those are my answers to Harry and to Andrew's question. But I have to, on the strength or weakness of the Georgia case, although I did write that first report, Jen, you've been way out there with me that this is the silver bullet. And it doesn't have the political baggage of DOJ, a DOJ headed by a Biden appointee prosecuting Trump.
And I want to highlight a few things that the report did that just double down and double down. One is there's another official that Trump contacted directly that we didn't really hear about before, Francis Watson, who apparently was another official, and he's calling her directly. And he sent Meadows to go to the offices and pull her aside to question her. She may be a knockout witness for us, and we really haven't seen her. There's no evidence at this point that the committee actually interviewed her. Maybe we're going to get that transcript. We haven't yet. So that's yet another kind of element. And what you see is that in contrast, perhaps to the larger federal case, there are so many actions by Trump in furtherance of this prosecution, the call to Raffensperger, the call to Watson. And the committee did something that was also interesting and perhaps unexpected, which is that the harassment of Lady Ruby and the Georgia officials was also in furtherance. It wasn't just a discrete, nasty, bad political thing that he was doing. This was part of the pressure campaign designed to put pressure on Ratzenberger and the others. So even the defamation of the officials, the multiple calls to multiple officials, Trump is really front and center in this in a way that he isn't in other parts, I think, of the larger federal case. So I think she's got, a ways to work on that. Andrew, you're looking skeptical at me. Go ahead.
No. I totally agree with you. I was going to say, I thought the denigration of Lady Ruby and the election workers was not only not tangential, it was actually critical to the idea that they were in fact the ones who were claimed to have tampered with votes by having, instead of it, what was a ginger mint, it was a USB port. But if I were Jack Smith, that is really great evidence for also the larger conspiracy. If you're trying to not have the federal case fail on the lips and this idea of Brandenburg and First Amendment, you need to expand it to the way that the January 6th committee did to talk about all of the various ways the conspiracy worked. I would charge this as one overarching conspiracy. Some people would say a RICO. Wow. I don't really see that because I can see it as just being too over the top, although it could conceivably be charged that way. But this would be, to me, I've never really understood separating the two. It's like there's a great Georgia case. I totally understand and agree with what you and Norm said and the advantages of it, not to mention it's not federally pardonable, which I think is to me is the critical aspect. I mean, because all of the federal stuff could easily just go away if there's a Republican president. But to me, it's just such a critical, because it's so strong, it's such a critical piece of a larger federal case that could be brought.
We've all fielded questions over the last couple of days. What surprised you most about the report? And this aspect that the Raffensperger call was one of 200 contacts. Really sort of blew my mind. Andrew, I want to stick with one more general prosecutor question for Smith, which is, on the January 6 crimes, do you see them as makeable, as indictable in the absence of a cooperating, co-conspirator, and that raises the points that Norm made, as well as a time issue, because if you do the cooperate or we're going to charge you, and they say charge me, now there's maybe a year. Do you think that Smith and the department need to turn somebody fairly big in order to make any of the January 6th cases?
Well, in this case, I don't think you absolutely need it. There are other cases where I really do feel like you need somebody on the inside. So, for instance, Thomas Barrack was a lesser known figure, was prosecuted in the Eastern District recently for essentially foreign agent registration type crimes. And there was no insider. And as soon as that case opened, I was like, I don't know how you're going to make that case without an insider talking about it. And I'm very used to juries later saying, oh, we didn't really need that person. It was sort of icing. They don't really mean it that way. What they really mean is that story made so much sense and hung together given all of the other proof, and it allowed them to psychologically say we're not really relying on it, but it's very useful to have a narrator. We put Rick Gates on in the first Manafort trial precisely for that reason. Obviously, we indicted that case without Rick Gates being a cooperator, and so we could have done it without him, but it's really useful to have someone tell the story. Now, it's important to remember there actually are already cooperating witnesses. So, Cassidy Hutchinson is cooperating. But if you
not a co-conspirator, though.
Yeah, exactly. So that's just to be clear. What you're saying, this is more for the audience. What we're talking about is somebody who has real liability. So, like a Mark Meadows who has pled guilty and has admitted what happened, and then walks people through it. Obviously, that's the ideal. And that's where, to me, Jack Smith, that's what you work on right now, which is, you sort of go up the chain
Yeah.
and look at the report, and you see who can be flipped to as criminal liability. And that can be junior people, and it doesn't have to be all the way to Mark Meadows, that can get you there.
That was so effective.
I just
that
tweeted
was
out.
One of the,
go ahead, Nort. Sorry.
That was one of the things that the January 6th committee did that was so effective. And they did it both through a combination of the senior people. I had a big debate with John Dean about Pat Cipollone, both of us as veterans of the White House counsel's office, in which he insisted that Pat should, because of his own liability, should not testify. But they stitched it together, even with Pat asserting bogus executive privilege claims. They were able to do Pat, Bill Barr, and then the lower people like Cassidy Hutchison. And so you had, and they crow about this. It's the conclusion of the executive summary. All the Republican witnesses, they have an army of Sherpas. It was like Everest, where they have villages full of Sherpas to carry all the stuff of the tourists.
There's a great piece in the New York Times that has the best behind the scenes, and they talk about creating a documentary, an oral history. And that's such a perfect description, because they weave a script built by pieces of evidence, pieces of testimony. Now, that raises an interesting question, whether all of that's admissible evidence and whether, it's going to be as neat and clean. One thing on the need to flip someone, I think it may not be necessary on the defrauding for the reasons we talked about in Georgia. It may not be needed in the obstruction of the official proceeding. But on insurrection, I think there is this missing link between, obviously, the militia groups, the extremist groups, and Trump. You have circumstantial evidence, but we have yet to pierce that Willard headquarters. We have yet to pierce exactly what Trump knew about them. There's lots of circumstantial evidence that he knew who these people were. He encouraged them. He drove by their rallies that were preceding this. He refused entrees to tell them to be peaceful. But you don't really have the knot where he says, I want these people to go up there and raise hell. And I don't think you're going to get that without a Meadows or someone else who was either
Roger Stone, maybe.
Roger Stone.
Well, that's never.
Roger
Stone and Steve Bannon are never happening.
Right.
I mean, like Rudy might cooperate, but he's so insane. I don't know if he's usable as a witness. So I think you're going to have, for that kind of a charge, even though you can say, oh, wow, there's all this, evidence. I don't know if Andrew is a
you
prosecutor.
You got to take it. As a defense lawyer, I would break this down charge by charge, and I would be looking for the gaps. So if you read carefully, for example, I agree, there is so much more connective tissue in this report. They put in 1001 to do a simple or skinny case, I think, to suggest, because they had a ton of ex-prosecutors working on this case up there. If you look at the roster,
and they're going to get a lot of cooperators there, actually.
So, if you look at the false elector case, though, when you go through, now there is powerful stuff. Cassidy, for the first time, saying there were dozens of calls that Meadows had on the false elector scheme, and really taking it day by day in chapters 2 and 3 with a Georgia focus, because they're not stupid. The first people who are going to use this report to prosecute is Georgia, and reportedly they have a very cordial relationship and they've been sharing information. And by the way, the report also says that they sent the obstruction information to federal prosecutors and Fani Willis. Over and over again, when they talk about the evidence of obstruction, they point to Fani because it's an obstruction of her investigation too. But look at, for example, on page 270 of the report, where a copy of the fake electors, an early iteration of the fake electors plan, goes to the Oval Office. It says Dan Scavino was asked to print it for the president. He wrote, printed, and may have shared it with the president anyway. So there's a lot of stuff like that where they're subtly pointing out where the gaps are, where the gaps have to be filled. Now, they wouldn't prosecute Scavino. That might have applied some pressure to him if they'd have done the contempt prosecution for Scavino, but for the same reasons as Meadows, they wouldn't do it. So Jack Smith has a ways to go on this fake elector plan. Fani Willis may be there. She's been putting people in the grand jury now for a while, so she may have filled the gap sufficiently. And remember, she probably has cut a deal now. Remember, she went to court to split David Schaefer, the ringleader, the head of the Georgia Republican Party, off from the body of the fake electors. She may have cut deals with those fake electors to have the TikTok on the scheme in Georgia.
He does have a ways to go on anything. And the normal, what Andrew, delineated of the normal work your way up the ladder, there's just not time for, especially if you consider this pardon issue. I tweeted out this morning, I'd like your thoughts on it. Why not now go straight to the penultimate step, straight to Meadows, and say we're going to charge you or you're going to cooperate? I think there's a lot of evidence on him, and and make the hard decision. So do you go right now to Meadows? I know it's unorthodox. And do you, as part and parcel of that, are you prepared to immunize him? Is that all crazy premature?
My view is you only go to somebody like that and make that ultimatum if you're going to charge. I mean, your bond is your word.
You can't unless you're ready to charge.
And you better have your ducks in a row and have the case done. I don't know exactly what they have yet internally. I would be very surprised if Jack is ready to do that. And I think he is a very aggressive, very tenacious prosecutor. But my suspicion is that he is looking under the hood in terms of what they have, sees a huge mountain of new evidence and leads. He's probably still in the middle of sort of assessing his team and their work product and how many horses he has to really pull this along. And I just think when you do that, you have to be ready to charge. I mean, there's nothing, you cannot make a fake sort of ultimatum, and that will be under enormous scrutiny.
No, huge.
Whether you have your ducks in a row. So I just don't think. And then the issue of immunizing, I'm just telling you what my view would be. I would never at this stage decide to immunize Mark Meadows, given the level of culpability. We're not talking about a sort of Cassidy Hutchinson type person where it would be much more acceptable to give immunity. I just, it's like to me, someone asked me that same question about Jeff Clark, and I just don't see in any, in God's green earth, the Department of Justice giving immunity to somebody like Jeff Clark.
Yeah, all good, and maybe we'll leave it here. Except there's a lot on Meadows that came out with the report, and witnesses like Cassidy Hutchinson. I don't even think it's in the same category. Are there? But all points very well taken.
Thing?
Can I? Yeah, sure. And then I want to switch to the congressman.
They're all
members, congressmen.
The sinful six: Trump, Meadows, and the four lawyers, Giuliani, Clark, Eastman, and Chesborough. You really have to, the committee has shrewdly drawn a line underneath them.
Yeah.
They're all true believers, and they may very well play a game of waiting for Trump or DeSantis to win in 24 and to pardon them. That's another reason I like the Georgia case. Pardons in Georgia go through a bipartisan state board, including with a bunch of Kemp people who have no love lost for Trump. So they're not getting out of, if you can get convictions in Georgia, it's a big if, the federal pardon play isn't there for them.
All right. So I'd like to take just a couple minutes to ask if you think there's any prospect of the 34 or 5 or 1. 34 being, who Meadows was in touch with, 5 being the contemnors, and 1 being Scott Perry, who's got substantive involvement, especially on the Clark side, getting any comeuppance. But then I think we should let's then move on to some of the things in the appendices, the Department of Defense and the FBI and such. But can I just serve up, if anyone has any opinions about what happened? Do all the members here skate?
Well,
There's
the
not enough
quick thing
evidence. I don't see the evidence now. But all it takes is one of them to buckle at the knees, and it is possible. There is also the possibility that the DOJ has information that we don't, that they have the content of those emails, and they have more extensive conversations that they had.
And they certainly have the will, unlike Congress. They love going after members of Congress. Yeah, sorry, Andrew.
So I see them as right now as if I were Jack Smith, I would be putting some of them in the grand jury. I mean, Kevin McCarthy has some really terrific evidence that's been reported about direct communications with Donald Trump on January 6th. And that is something you would want at the trial. So I can't imagine that he is not going to get a grand jury subpoena to testify. So I see them very much being put into that position as potential witnesses. It is true some of them may take the 5th, which if they do correctly, we wouldn't know about. But I think some of that is going to just be work for Jack Smith. And given his prior position as head of public integrity, I think, he knows his way around that particular terrain.
All right, let's move to the appendices.
Hold on. I want to weigh in as a swamp creature because Andrew is looking at this as Andrew is looking at this properly as a federal prosecutor, a coastal elite. But I have lived my past 30 years in the swamp. And this is a
That's not a coastal elite.
Okay,
that's your credential. Okay,
sloppy coastal elite. Andrew, there's two additional. Of course, I agree with you on the quality of Kevin McCarthy's proof, but there's 2 additional considerations. One is political, and one is constitutional. He may have a speech and defense debate for those conversations, that it was part of his, there's an issue in the jurisprudence about when legislative contacts with the executive branch are privileged under the speech and debate clause and when not. And the dividing line, it's murky, but the dividing line is if it's an essential part of your legislative duties. And he may have an argument, I was talking to Trump because on January 6th, when I had an official duty to try to get him. So there's a constitutional defense.
I'll take the government side on that one, especially at the district court level before Beryl Howell, that this had his saying to Donald Trump, "Who do you think you're talking to?" when Donald Trump said it's Antifa, and he's like, "Are you joking?" I don't see that as part of a legislative fix that Kevin McCarthy was thinking about on January 6th. But Norm, you're totally right that will be a defense that is raised. But if I were in the government, I would be like, I'm willing to litigate that.
And by the way,
the other thing is the politics of going after at the moment, we'll see how likely it is, the likely Speaker of the House. Boy, you do that with great, great trepidation.
Let me just say,
I agree, but I just say if I were Jack Smith, my view would be the grand jury is entitled to everyone's testimony. And you know what?
Definitely.
And more so if you are actually a public servant. Your role should. Now, I agree. If it was abusive, absolutely, it would be improper. And I agree with you. There is definitely a political consequence. But with Kevin McCarthy, I mean,
DOJ's leverage is stronger,
and there's just a critical need for it.
We've gotten a little bit of a preview, by the way. Insofar as Lindsey Graham tried pulling the speech and debate, this got litigated. Right. They said there was enough areas that were not entailed. Now, obviously, he would say, oh, I had a constitutional duty to, at some point, also vote on the electors. So I was doing my due diligence. State court judges didn't buy that. Federal court judges didn't buy that. And he actually rendered testimony. So we're forgetting Lindsey Graham as an interesting witness to part of this stuff.
All right, I would love to go. No, I would love to go for hours on this, and we could. I'm worried about the listeners. I want to just move a little bit to appendices, other agencies, DOD, FBI, the whole alphabet soup, and how. Discuss. Anybody?
I think these appendices are the result of the bad story in the Washington Post that the purple team and the mauve team and the fuchsia team, that those teams, their work was not being used. They leaked furiously to the Post like, oh my God, we have to use their work.
Right. Without commenting on the Washington Post's sourcing, listen, the excuse, if you will, that they gave is no one could possibly have imagined that Donald Trump would have sent the mob down Pennsylvania Avenue to provide sort of this phalanx of momentum behind the Proud Boys. So yes, they had enough people for, a few hundred troublemakers, but who could have foreseen Donald Trump would send thousands and thousands and they'd be armed to the teeth? I don't think this is 9/11, where it takes such a leap of imagination to imagine people would, take an airplane and, fly into buildings. They apparently had sourcing about this. Certainly
direct.
Apparently, they had the requests for the people on the ellipse for the permits.
Yep.
So, they knew people were going to be there. Did they think Donald Trump was just going to, say, thanks for everything you've done? So that, to me, strikes me as pretty poor. And what I see there and what I saw in the interplay between DOD and the National Guard is no one kind of had the motion. Everyone is talking, everyone is collecting information, but there's nobody who is pushing this to operationalize what is being discussed. And where is Chris Wray in all of this? Was his name even mentioned in the report? I don't know. On the DOD side, it's this, Alphonse and Gaston kind of routine, you go, no, you go, no, you go. And it was hampered on the DOD side by the fact you had this guy who should not have been in that job at all. Miller was an acting. He had not been a deputy. He was probably ill-equipped. And, so this confusion about who was going to act. And I think you can't let...
In 2022, it's too late for that excuse.
Yeah. I mean, listen, do I think that there was evidence that they deliberately dragged their feet and let this play out? No. And I think the report is helpful in that. Do I think that there was a level of incompetence and disorganization, which actually should be addressed? Because in the future, who's going to be the driving force, when DOD and the National Guard get in this, when intelligence agents, our agencies are aware of some kind of civil disturbance? Yes. And I really would have liked for that to be, frankly, dealt with in a way. Otherwise, they are handing something to the Republicans who say, listen, what are these guys? Now, by the way, I don't think the Republicans are going to be all that interested in investigating this, because it's just going to re-raise the entire issue of January 6th. So I don't think this is going to be on Kevin McCarthy's list of, things. They'll go on making noises about how it was all, Nancy Pelosi's fault. But I think from a historical and from a governmental governance and recommendation standpoint, I think the committee did not do as good a job here, to put it mildly.
I couldn't agree more. I think this is like the big open issue with lots more to investigate. If I were, in the Democratic Senate side, this is like something that you could continue. It's an unfinished story. I think it's really deplorable I've just been a huge critic of the way the FBI has publicly responded to what I view as not an intelligence failure, but a failure to act on intelligence and actually being responsible about assessing what happened here. And it could be a combination of things. It could be incompetence. It could be politics, not wanting to take on Donald Trump, knowing what side he was on. As he said, these people were not there to attack him. And it could also be a function of racism in the comparison in terms of how they reacted to Black Lives Matter, certainly at the Bureau, where it was over the top compared to what they were doing on January 6th. And it could be some combination that is extremely important to get to the bottom of. It's to me, that is a Merrick Garland failing in part. It is a DHS failing in part. It's a DOD failing not to be addressing this. I just to give a shout out to, I was raised at the FBI by Bob Mueller, where when something like this happened, you figured out what happened, you admitted it publicly, you gave a diagnosis, and then you gave what you were going to do about it and a system to audit what it is you're doing about it. And you just owned it. There's just legion examples that people who worked at the FBI had of Director Mueller setting that example over and over again when something went wrong. And I think that's something for, this is a Biden administration issue that needs to be dealt with. So I couldn't agree with Jen more. And the one thing just finally about the Alphonse Gaston is it goes a little bit beyond DOD, because you also have DOJ with people saying, oh, well, DOJ was supposed to be the lead, and then DOJ denying that it was going to be the lead. It was only going to be the lead on certain things. And I sort of smelled a rat there. I mean, my antenna went up as to what exactly happened. And again, I think that's where you'd want to know, were people sort of denying it and not wanting to take the lead because of the sort of, no one wanted the political football. And I guess I should say one final piece to support Jen's comment, which is Mark Milley, who comes off extremely well in this report, when he was asked about the potential violence, he said, everyone knew that there was this
That's
huge
the killer point.
For violence. And he specifically raised the issue of the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers because he saw the permits and knew that they were coming. He knew they were violent. And he said, what are we doing about it? Is there a way to deny the permits? I mean, he was very focused on this issue beforehand. And the comment, everyone knew, I mean, you can't get more stronger than that.
Any thoughts, Norm? Last word to you if you want it.
I agree.
Okay.
That
was easy to diagram.
I agree with Jen and Andrew. The last note I'll say is, Jen, I think the counterpoint is, or the implication of all that is the void at the top, and that's Trump's failure to act, 187 minutes. So they go to great pains to describe, this body politic fumbling around without a head, right? And it's Donald Trump's inaction that goes with that inaction, and they're explicit about it. But we need a belt and suspenders. I'll end where I started with. Look at the DC National Guard in one of the thousands of new pieces of information in this report that's so striking. The commander of the DC National Guard, who wanted to break the chain of command, he would have been fired and court-martialed in order to immediately deploy his impulse, contrast that with Trump's impulse and the failures at, the acting at DOD and the others, just horrible, shameful.
Harry, is it time for us to all get Chinese food?
Yeah, exactly. Or we can do our, no, I think it's actually time for us to sign off. Jen, Andrew, and Norm, this has been so great I think for all of us who have to do, try to be sage and comprehensive in 3.5 minutes to actually be able to air it out has been fantastic. Thanks so much for joining. On this Christmas Day, I think we can close with a reference to Charles Dickens. God bless us all, everyone, and the January 6th committee, and Fonnie Willis, and Jack Smith, too. Thanks very much, guys.
Also the 8th day of Hanukkah.
Merry
Yom
Christmas.
Tov.
And what are you ordering at the Chinese restaurant? Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video and other Talking Feds content, please take a second to like and subscribe. Talk to you later.